Please welcome to the stage Professor Debbie Ging.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. I feel like my presentation is going to bring the mood down a little bit, so I apologize in advance for that. So I guess the starting point of my presentation today is kind of depressing, in that we are seeing a steady increase, a constant upward trajectory in the experience of women and LGBTQ people of gendered and sexual abuse online. If we look at the European reports, the national reports, the global reports, unfortunately what we see is this steady upward trajectory. So a Pew Research Centre report in 2017 showed that 21% of women aged 18 to 29 reported being sexually harassed online. An Amnesty study in 2018 reported that 23% of women surveyed across 8 countries had experienced online abuse or harassment at least once. A more recent UNESCO study of journalists shows that 73% of women had experienced online violence and 20% had been abused offline in connection with this violence. So the statistics indicate that it's becoming more extreme and that it's also spilling over into people's careers and into people's lives in a more serious way. A YouGov poll in 2021 here in the UK reported that almost half of women aged 18 to 24 had received unsolicited sexual images in the previous year. And based on the work that I've been doing with colleagues out in schools, talking to young people, I would estimate that among younger women and girls that percentage is much, much higher. They tell us that it's so ubiquitous, it's just become completely normalized to receive unsolicited dick pics. Second point is that there's now much more awareness of this as a significant problem. So in one way, that's a good thing. Not just for individual victims, but there's a discussion about how this toxic environment is harming democracy, online safety, and the quality of our digital lives. So we're having a conversation about this issue in terms of its significance socially, I think. There's also much more awareness of male supremacism online, for better or for worse. Firstly, because of a lot of high-profile killings that have been associated with the incel community, but also because of influencer figures like Andrew Tate, also kind of gateway academics like Jordan Peterson, who have been mainstreaming a lot of these ideas in recent years. So it's been very frustrating working on the manosphere, because for a long time people would insist that this is a niche subculture, that this is not really something that's out in the mainstream. So it's very strange to say that it's gratifying. Of course it's not gratifying to see this out in the mainstream. It's absolutely not what anybody would have wanted, but there is at least a conversation about it now, and people are acknowledging that it's not just confined or contained to niche subcultures. So a lot of people are shocked when they realize the extent of online misogyny, when they start hearing about the nature of the hate, transphobic and racist hate, obviously, as well, that people are exposed to. And the first question a lot of people will ask is, has society become more misogynistic, or has the internet simply revealed to us something that was already there? And the first culprit, usually, that people point the finger at is technology. And of course, technology plays a vital role in this. We're talking ultimately about digital hate and online misogyny. But did the internet cause it? What role does technology play here? How significant is it? And we can't overlook the technological affordances of the internet and of social media in particular, in terms of how they've amplified and networked anti-woman actors. They facilitate, as we know, anonymous and therefore unpunished attacks. They gamify hateful behaviours, they create echo chambers, filter bubbles, and of course radicalisation pathways. So the role of technology is very significant. But we have to also be wary of these kinds of technological determinist accounts which overemphasize the role of technology. Very often these ideas or these theories go hand in hand with the few bad apples theory, which is that a minority of trolls or a few bad apples are behind all of this, and the internet has simply amplified them or given them a platform that they wouldn't have had before that. And we see this a lot also in the way people talk about the rise of the far right, that these are just a few nut jobs that before the internet wouldn't have had access or wouldn't have had a platform, now they do. And this is a problematic theorization, I think, of this problem. It's also linked with the idea of toxic masculinity, again, a kind of what has become a kind of individualizing concept or theory of bad actors and misogyny, and it's become a kind of catch-all for sexist behaviour that's been misinterpreted largely as meaning that men themselves are toxic, and as opposed to toxic masculinity being a set of learned behaviours that is aimed at subjugating women and LGBTQ people. So ultimately what we've ended up with is a not terribly useful concept, I would argue, in toxic masculinity, in that it has been misinterpreted as an individual characteristic of men or manhood rather than something that is learned and something that's socially constructed. And often it's used in conjunction with the bad apples theory. So technology alone didn't cause this, and it's not just a few bad apples. We have to look to broader explanations. And obviously economics and the socio-economic context is really important here. Michael Kimmel has talked about the neoliberal restructuring and destabilization of the labour market as playing a vital role here in causing a sense of aggrieved entitlement among many men. Because if you think about what the traditional signifiers of masculinity have been for many decades and centuries, it is career, it's your job, the amount of money you earn that confers power and status on you in the society. That in turn enables you to buy property. That in turn, in a patriarchal society, enables you to marry or to be marriageable. And all of these things have disappeared in the space of one generation for a lot of men. They'll probably never own their own property, for example. And they may be working in the gig economy rather than having a career for life, which is another guarantee of traditional masculinity that has kind of disappeared. So these things are really important as well in trying to understand where this sense of aggrievement comes from that male supremacist groups are tapping into. But we also have to look at the gender political element of this, that misogyny is not, as my colleague Eugenia Saipera has argued, it's not just a sentiment, and we have to stop thinking of it as just a sentiment. It's also a strategy, and it's a strategy, she argues, that's used in times of structural crisis to exclude women from the means of production. In other words, this is deliberate, it's strategic, it's gender political. And this extends to the far right because obviously, male supremacism is a tactic of the far right. It's a gateway very often into the far right, because for them, the subjugation of women is key. So all of these factors play a role, or have played a role, in creating this scenario of digital hate. Digital hate is both personal and political. It's both structural and agentic. But the other thing that somehow has been left out, I think, very often of these discussions is the role played by culture. So I was keenly following the rise of lad culture and post-feminism in the 1990s and the noughties, when we saw the reappearance of what was called at the time a form of ironic sexism and a return to very kind of polarized binary notions of gender, this kind of really hard, laddish masculinity on one end of the spectrum, and hyper-femininity and hyper-sexualized images of femininity on the other, and also very binary discourses of gender suddenly appeared in the culture. And I think this period was a really important yet underestimated and unacknowledged factor in facilitating what was to come next. So we had, as part of post-feminism and lad culture, which are effectively two sides of the same coin, the myth of equality achieved. So post-feminism was a kind of cultural moment. It wasn't a movement. It wasn't a coherent philosophy or set of ideas. It was a kind of dominant cultural moment that lasted, I guess, 15 years at least. And that period, as I say, created, I think, a kind of a void, a kind of a vacuum, which made it much easier for the manosphere to put down roots afterwards. Because this myth of equality achieved, this idea that feminism had achieved its goals and equality had been successfully achieved, became very pervasive in the culture. But effectively what it did was rolled back or capitulated on pretty much all of second wave feminism's key tenets. So the idea that consumerism was empowering became a key facet of post-feminist culture. Feminism, second wave feminism, was very critical of the kind of the tyranny of consumerism, particularly for women. It also maintained that sexual objectification was empowering. So it turned that notion of being objectified on its head and made sexual objectification empowering. We saw this in the kind of mainstreaming of lap dancing, of pole dancing. Female violence became empowering in a lot of films and advertising texts as well. Pornography and sex work were seen also as empowering, not in the sense of any concern over sex workers' rights or forming unions, but rather in a very kind of commercialized sexual liberation discourse. And genetic determinism became acceptable through a slew of self-help books like Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, Why Men Don't Iron, Why Men Can't Load a Dishwasher and Women Can't Read Maps, etc., etc. There's like literally hundreds of them. This was the bestseller, but there were lots and lots of them. And there's a kind of strange paradox in all of this, I thought at the time. I didn't really buy the argument that this was ironic or performed. But there's a strange paradox in that if gender equality had been achieved, surely then we would have moved into a kind of post-gender phase where discussion about gender would have become much less prevalent and much less important. But in fact, the opposite was the case. We had this massive revival in gender binarism and in genetic determinism, in clothes, in toys, in advertising, in films, in TV shows, in computer games. It was everywhere. So there was a big kind of paradox there in this revival of hard laddism and hypermasculinity. War of the sexes discourses became really popular in all forms of mainstream media. And so while lots of elements of post-feminism were fun and exciting, and there was this discourse of freedom and choice, and playing up performative sexuality and performative gender roles, I think ultimately, well, I don't think, I posit ultimately that it was an extremely regressive period and an extremely regressive phenomenon. Because none of it unsettled patriarchy in any way. And I've always had a hunch that, it's kind of litmus test. If you're upsetting patriarchy or you're upsetting a particular type of man, then you're doing the right thing. If you're not upsetting them, then you're not. And none of this was unsettling or disturbing to patriarchal power relations. And at the same time, I was keeping an eye on men's politics and men's rights politics and seeing the growth of that already on the internet in groups like angryharry.com and A Voice for Men, the American men's rights organization, Fathers for Justice. These groups were mobilizing on the internet at the time. We also had a slew of kind of aggrieved masculinity films like Fight Club and many, many more. The publication of Iron John, all of this was moving towards a much more kind of political form of aggrievement than the cultural domain would have you believe. So there was a lot of stuff brewing at the time, I think, and yet nobody was talking about misogyny. Nobody was talking about patriarchy. Nobody was talking about feminism. There was this kind of embargo almost on those words during the heyday of post-feminism. And ultimately, I think this is how we ended up with the manosphere. It's a kind of perfect storm of economic restructuring around techno-capitalism, the shift into a new form of capitalism, data capitalism, the internet, social media, gender political weaknesses that were created by all of this post-feminist period, and of course, these also facilitated the rise of the far right. So we have, I think now, a lack of faith in political leadership, which allows conspiracy theories to flourish. And all of this, I think, made it possible for the manosphere and for men's rights to galvanize around a particular set of male insecurities. So I followed the men's rights movement as it moved online. I followed it in particular during the transition from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0, when it underwent to social media, user-produced content. And this is when it underwent its most extreme transformation from conventional political mobilizing, protesting, signing petitions, etc., to a politics instead of extreme emotion, a politics that was about personal storytelling and pain, a very different type of politics. It was also characterized by antagonism, by bad faith arguments, by disinformation and conspiracy theories. So in many ways, Web 2.0, on the shift to social media, heralded this new era, if you like, of bad faith arguments and disinformation. It facilitated it in many ways. So we can't ignore how these technological features, like echo chambers, etc., enable radicalization, enable ideological contagion. And they undoubtedly do. But we have to keep in mind all of the time the role played by socioeconomic and cultural factors as well, the kind of broader picture, which is allowing these things to happen, as well as the psychosocial factors that would predispose certain boys and men to become involved in these formations. So I got some research leave in 2016, and I spent that year in the manosphere effectively. And by the end of that year, apart from being a little disturbed, I realized that this wasn't just a niche subculture of disaffected young men, that this was something much more serious and much more pervasive. So who are the manosphere? Who are the new misogynists? So we can group them, or at least I group them, into these main categories of the broad kind of men's rights activists, pick-up artists, men going their own way, traditional conservatives, and involuntary celibates. These are the kind of key formations within the manosphere. So men's rights activists is the kind of more mainstream form of men's rights activism that we'll see on the American website or group A Voice for Men, also on Reddit, men's rights threads, etc. Pickup artists have grown out of or created, if you like, the seduction industry, also known as game, heavily involved in anti-feminist men's rights, but also this is a kind of a commercial faction of the manosphere. Most of these guys are out to make money, and it's a kind of pyramid selling scheme where they train lots of other men to go out and learn pickup artistry, etc., and invest in their companies. So this is kind of the origins of a lot of Andrew Tate's kind of business model as well. So they don't always get on either. I mean, incels hate pickup artists because they maintain that pickup artists' tactics don't work, for example. Then we have MGTOWs, who are men going their own way. These are a kind of a separatist group who've decided to have nothing to do with women at all, although they talk about women a lot. They've decided to have nothing to do with Western women, at least, because they're too infected by feminism. So they talk about male sovereignty. They're kind of inspired by some of the 1990s mythopoetic stuff, the Iron John stuff, the idea of going out and trying to discover your innate masculinity by beating drums or whatever. And then we have a more traditional conservative, Republican American strand, which is no longer confined to the US, which is heavily invested in the military, in the idea of family. This is a very conservative strand. Again, these would not often agree on lots of things. For example, the incel community is much more kind of techno-libertarian. They wouldn't agree about, they exist in quite different cultures. And then finally, incels are involuntary celibates. At the moment, I'm doing a large image study of incel culture, thousands and thousands of memes and images, which is quite something. Because memes actually only account for, I think, I can't remember what percentage, but not a huge percentage of their image culture. I mean, there's lots more besides just memes, but they do communicate a lot of their ideas through these memes and these particular recurring kind of characters. So incels are involuntary celibates, men who have not been able to secure romantic or sexual relationships with women. They maintain that they are the genetic losers of the alpha, beta, incel hierarchy, and that they're genetically that they're not actually an ideological group, they're not political, and their fate has been decided for them by genetics. It's not their fault, it's because of how they look. And they use ideas derived from evolutionary psychology, as do all of the manosphere, to defend their arguments. And it's interesting, actually, watching Lucy's amazing presentation this morning, it's interesting how much of the manosphere draws upon the natural world, including Andrew Tate. He's never done talking about gorillas, to justify their idea that there are only two genders, and that it's, to justify their kind of normative heterosexist vision of the world. And within incels, then you have red pill and black pill, so those incels who try to ascend through looks maxing and gym maxing and trying to improve their bodies, sometimes through very extreme measures, because they're obsessed with the idea of having a strong jawline, which they maintain women are attracted to height, etc. And black-pilled incels who have basically given up, and that this is a really dark, depressing, fatalistic community of mostly young men who believe that there is no hope, and they talk about suicidal ideation a lot. It's a very, very dismal place to be. So a lot of this looks kind of crazy from the outside, I think. They do. They look like really deranged cults or something. It just doesn't make sense to most of us looking in on this. But if you are a young man who has no knowledge of the backstory of feminism, and you get most of your information and your entertainment through your laptop, and you've no job, you're at home all the time, or you work in the gig economy maybe, you'll never afford your own home, you were maybe bullied in school, you may be socially isolated, you probably are, you may be neurodivergent, as many incels claim to be. And this is not just incels, this is all of these groups. And all you hear about from the kind of mainstream normie world is masculinity in crisis, girl power, women have it all, etc. And all you see on social media is attractive, sexually successful people. These communities offer, I think, a kind of solidarity, a support network, a sense of purpose. And they're accessible in a way. They offer kind of accessible explanations or simple explanations for the complexity of the world and the state that it's in. They simplify a complex world. And so they have an attraction, I think, that's not immediately apparent to other people. The other thing I want to talk about is, this is the kind of anguish that's constantly expressed in incel culture and anger, is Gamergate. Because Gamergate in 2014 was also a turning point in the kind of discursive, rhetorical language of the culture wars. And it became a kind of manual for bad actors in how to use disingenuous tactics, orchestrated pylons, bad faith arguments, sock puppet accounts, etc., to advance an ideological agenda. And it led to figures like Milo Yiannopoulos, Steve Bannon, Gavin McInnes, and Richard Spencer, etc., gaining prominence, and ultimately, one might argue, to the 2016 election of Trump as US president. So you could say that Gamergate effectively established or played a significant role in establishing a catalogue of tactics that have since become dominant in men's rights politics, as well as far-right politics, namely sabotage, surveillance and sexual shaming, and indoctrination. So if we look just briefly at some of these, sabotage can work at the individual level, but it can also work at the level of economic vandalism and also political manipulation. And these tactics, we think of digital hate or online misogyny, we often think of verbal abuse or just, written abuse. But it's much more technologically complex. It's much more creative than that, unfortunately. These are very tech-savvy people, a lot of them, and they are able to hack and to orchestrate all kinds of coordinated attacks on computer systems. They use image manipulation, including deepfakes, to deepfake women into porn and then send those videos to their work, for example. Swatting attacks, swarm attacks, fake rape reports, false flag campaigns, etc. And those false flag campaigns are specifically designed to bait feminists into adopting increasingly extreme positions, thereby causing infighting and provoking outrage among conservatives, and then turning moderate and liberal feminists off the movement. So they're really quite complex strategies at work here. You also have economic vandalism, the desire to sabotage people's livelihoods and websites to destroy their professional reputation. And an example of that was the Thought audit campaign in 2018. So Thought stands for that hoe over there. It's a word they use to describe women, along with Foyd and Roasty, for example. But this was about reporting sex workers, online sex workers, so people, basically women with OnlyFans accounts, to the American Inland Revenue because they maintained they weren't paying tax. Now, I don't think anything ever came of this because it's actually quite complicated to fill out those forms. So it seems, that this was really all talk. But it did mean that a lot of OnlyFans accounts got shut down, etc. So it's very targeted. These attacks are very orchestrated and targeted. And then, of course, political manipulation as well. So amplifying certain types of content, using bots and sock puppet accounts, grouping together to boost and decrease ratings artificially, astroturfing, so using fake grassroots efforts aimed at influencing public opinion. And MRAs, men's rights activists, are really well versed in these rhetorical strategies like sea lining, trolling that involves these persistent requests for evidence or basic information, gaslighting, straw man fallacies. They're really, really well versed in all of this. Then we have surveillance and sexual shaming, and a lot of this is about what's sometimes called revenge porn. And the fear now that women have, this kind of constant fear, a threat of exposure or being shamed online, not just by ex-boyfriends, but also by other political actors. And you know, nudes have a very significant transactional value. Those that involve the highest degree of trust and privacy violation are the most sought after in terms of exposure. And there's a whole lot of other technologically facilitated methods like upskirting, creep-shotting, taking images of women in public without their knowledge, or using the airdrop feature on iPhones to send women dick pics in public spaces that, you know, total strangers, if you have your airdrop feature on your phone open, for example. And the strategic weaponization then of DIY pornography. So all of these tactics mean this is this constant background of kind of fear that you could be one of these people who ends up having their image shared online as part of a strategic or orchestrated attack. And then finally we have indoctrination and radicalization. And Jaron Harabam maintains that we're living in a time of epistemic instability, where it's really increasingly difficult to know what's true and what isn't true. And in this kind of context, conspiracy theories can take hold really easily. If we return again to the wider picture, you know, the disruptions to white male privilege that we've talked about, economic instability, climate crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, anti-immigration propaganda, it's created a kind of perfect storm, if you like, for the manosphere and for the alt-right to push their great replacement narratives. We also have then, of course, algorithmic radicalization and the way in which algorithms are working proactively to push this content to boys and men all the time. So you have these rhetorical dog whistles, if you like, to communities of disenfranchised men who are looking for alternative narratives in a post-truth world, effectively. And in this context as well, Sarah Ahmed has made this point, feelings increasingly drive what she calls a politics of emotion. So the political space is highly emotional, is highly personal. Men's effective performances of victimization gain traction very quickly in this scenario. So we're looking at the moment, we're doing a study that's based on the same methodology as a study that Reset in Australia did, which is taking blank phones and setting up fake accounts on them. You can't put in the age on TikTok, but you can't put in your gender, but you can put in your age. And then on YouTube Shorts, you can. And we're looking, you know, we've put in different ages for boys and men, and then we have a control phone as well to see what kind of content gets pushed to you once the platform figures out that you're male. So, you know, you watch a bit of football, you watch a bit of gym stuff, and that's it. Suddenly it's just Andrew Tate, Andrew Tate, Andrew Tate. It is actually quite alarming. It's constant, proactive pushing of this content at boys and young men. And of course, moving into the next era of the digital virtual reality, automation and artificial intelligence is going to create ever more possibilities for sabotage, sexual shaming, surveillance and indoctrination by male supremacist formations. And this is why it's absolutely urgent that the design of AI is inclusive and is attendant to the kind of bias that can be built in to it. So to conclude, what are the kind of key takeaways? There's no meaningful distinction between online and offline. I think that's clear. If we look at the kind of creativity and the pervasive, invasive nature of digital abuse, it's highly effective. It becomes part of your life, of your body, of your emotions, of your every waking moment. Death and rape threats, stalking, coercive control, image-based sexual abuse, sextortion, doxing, hacking, coordinated pylons. These are all methods that go way beyond just trolling or hate speech or verbal abuse. They're not confined to the realm of the virtual, but they're deeply invasive, harmful practices, and they're designed to intimidate, to silence, and to suppress women. My colleague Eugenia Sayapera likens these attacks to the witch hunts of the Middle Ages, whereby women were spectacularly punished as a warning to other women. And it works. It has a chilling effect. We do self-censor. We do think twice about what we post because we don't want them piling on. We don't want them sending deep-faked images of us to our bosses, etc. Having said all that, it's still important not to overemphasize technological determinism. Too often, these forms of misogyny are associated, like I said earlier, with exclusively kind of niche subcultures. But they are phenomena that are deeply intertwined with the same patriarchal structures and gender relations that cause more traditional forms of sexual violence. It's a continuum, and they all work in tandem and in concert with one another. So, these ideas that men are entitled to sex, that women are earned, that sex is a form of achievement which confers status on men, that men have an uncontrollable sexuality, and that women are objects with transactional value to be rated, shared, and shamed. All of these things exist without technology as well. So to wrap it up, online misogyny is much more than a catalogue of acts perpetrated by individual men. It's part of a sustained and collective project to shame and subjugate all women, to discredit feminism, and to reinstate male privilege through the articulation of its loss, as Hamilton Carroll has argued. So the manosphere's tactics of digital hate are part of broader attempts to roll back progressive agendas and to have gender studies, for example, or critical race theory, LGBTQI content removed from schools and universities. They know that this is the pressure point. They know that this is where young people learn a different way of looking at the world and critiquing power structures, and that's why they have gone straight to this kind of flashpoint issue, if you like. It's not confined to the digital. It's gone from tweets to the streets, as we've seen in recent times. So although the manosphere's digital witch hunts frequently rely on personal attacks, they're not private, they're not individual, but rather systemic and ideological. And it's only in recognizing them as such that we can successfully tackle this problem through educational, legal, and platform governance-related interventions. Thank you.